Hey, this is Jamey Stegmeyer with Stonemaier Games, and today we're going to do something a little different. I have a special guest here, Ira Fay. Ira attended the recent Stonemaier Games Design Day, and I really wanted at Design Day to chat with Ira about combat systems because Ira was heavily involved in a recent game on Kickstarter, Arydia, The Paths We Dare Tread. And I didn't get to talk to him at Design Day because it was a crazy day with a lot of people there. And so I thought I would have a conversation with Ira that I could post on my YouTube channel. So Ira, why don't you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your involvement, big picture with Arydia.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Jamey.
Yeah.
So yeah, by day, I'm an educational game designer at a research lab at MIT doing digital game design. And I have also the good fortune and pleasure to get to do some board game design and development as well. So I've been working with Cody Miller, who is the designer of Arydia, for quite a few years at this point. And one of the things that I worked on with him was the combat system in Arydia. And so I'm looking forward to talking about that and seeing where this goes. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. I've done a few videos about combat systems, but it's an area of design that I really struggle with. And so it's fascinating for me to play games and talk about games that use combat systems. And today we're going to talk a little bit about, I think we'll talk probably mostly about combat systems where it's players fighting against the AI of the game, but we'll also talk about player versus player combat systems as well. But let's ground the discussion in one of the hottest games of the last few months, and let's talk about Arydia. Can you explain maybe I want to hear a lot of stories here, but maybe can you explain the core concept of how combat works in Arydia, and then along the way, you could talk about some of the things that you ran into while you were working on that design.
Sure. Yeah. So yes, I want to make sure we give due credit to Cody because he's the designer.
Yeah.
But he started working on it almost 7 years ago. He brought me onto the project about 4 years ago, part-time. So I think the most important thing to realize is that it's gone through many iterations. And I think that's an important design lesson for any designer. Just the number of iterations you have to do, the number of play tests, the number of revisions. That's really an important aspect of the design process. In terms of Arydia in particular, where it ended up right now, in terms of the final product, the basic idea in Arydia, it's a sort of fantasy RPG, but tabletop. So you're doing, adventuring in the world, you're collecting loot, there's a little bit of light role playing if you want to do that. And then there's combat. That's one of the main elements of the game. So you're exploring a location, monsters appear, and it's time for a battle. And you have a weapons that you have that have particular attack patterns. And you also have skills that you can choose to equip that do additional sorts of damage or battlefield control or healing or things like that. And so the very simplest idea is that you have a certain range, you have a line of sight towards a monster, and then you roll a d20, you add the appropriate stat, and then based on that result, you have a certain threshold of damage that you do. And I think that's one thing that I want to call out that's different in if people are familiar with D&D. Often what happens in D&D is you hit or you miss, and that's it. There's no sort of gradation of damage, and particularly with a D20, that can feel like fairly large random swings. And so in Arydia, that's not what happens. You have a gradation. If you roll a 1, you miss. If you roll a 2 through maybe 10, I mean, depending on what your stat is, depending on the weapon, you'll do 1 damage. If you roll a 11 through 18, you'll do 2 damage. If you roll a 19 or 20, you'll do 3 damage. And so from a game design perspective, we can balance that just fine. We know what the expected damage is. But I think from a player's perspective, it doesn't feel like an all or nothing hit or miss. And I think that mitigates some of the luck of the D20 roll. And then after you see how much damage you're going to do with a certain pattern that you have, then you apply it to the monster after you know how much damage you're doing. And I think that's an important element as well. So there's a luck of the roll, but then there's the skill of where you put it after you see the result of the roll. And I guess that's input randomness and output randomness, both. Really output randomness first and then input randomness.
There's another element that I want to talk about in a second about the Arydia combat that you haven't touched upon, but I want to talk about this first, because I think this is really cool. The idea that there are varying degrees of success or failure, not just one or the other. I talked about that recently on a skill test video, where some of my favorite skill tests aren't black and white. I used, I think, Destinies as an example. In Destinies, you might try to unlock a door, and it's not yes, you unlock it, or no, you don't unlock it. There are varying degrees to do that. You might learn a little bit about how to unlock the door, even if you fail, things like that. Were there any games that you played during the design process or since then, or that you can think of that use something like that, where it isn't just all or nothing in combat?
Sure. This is a little bit of a different genre of game, but I'll bring it out.
Yeah.
This is Sid Meier's Civilization, and in this game, when they first came out with it, it had a different combat system. But once they got to the first expansion, which I think was Fame and Fortune, or maybe it was Wisdom and Warfare, but I think it was Fame and Fortune. You had a hand of combat cards, and you wanted to sort of build up these standing forces of cards. And if you really won the battle very decisively, then you didn't lose any of your cards. You won the battle and you kept all your cards. But if you sort of had a medium win, you might lose some of these important cards, which are valuable resources in the game, but you still won the battle. Or in the worst case, sort of you lost a bunch of cards and you lost the battle. And so I think that's one example of a combat system where there's a gradation of success in the combat.
I like that. Yeah. Well, one example that comes to mind for me too is it's at the bottom of my pile of games, so I can't grab it here, but it's Tidal Blades. It isn't, again, it's a skill test. It's not exactly combat, but it includes, for each skill test, there are a few icons that you need to roll. And then there are a few icons, usually at least one, that you can push your luck and try to roll those icons as well. And so you can meet that threshold of success and then decide, do I continue to have like a great success, or do I stop now? And I find that, I think that's an interesting system as well, to give players that option where they reach that threshold and they can go a little bit above and beyond that as well.
Yeah, any sort of press your luck mechanic where you have gradations of results will lead to things like that. So that's a good thing for game designers to keep in mind.
Yeah. So let's talk about the other thing that really intrigued me about Arydia. There are a few other elements of combat here, but one of them is that the character that you're building in the game has different body parts, different things they can put on their body. And when the monsters attack you or strike back, what happens? Describe how that works.
Yeah, so you have a player mat which has 10 different locations on it: head, shoulders, arms, body, feet, where you can put armor. And then when the monsters attack, they roll a die that is appropriate for the type of strike that's coming in. There are 4 different asymmetric dice. They're six-sided dice, and depending on what you roll as a result of the hit location, that's the spot on your body that takes the damage. And just to be clear, credit 100% to Cody on that, because I had a different proposed a different and more complicated system, and he came up with that. It's much better. But yeah, what's interesting, I think, about that is maybe you have comments on that, Jamey. Did you want to comment on it?
Go ahead and say what's interesting about it. I definitely have comments and compliments.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I think one of the things that works really well about that is in Arydia, Cody sort of articulated some high-level design goals for combat, and one of them was we didn't want enemy turns to take too long. We wanted them to feel alive, but we wanted it to be quick to resolve. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful about this system. You look at, let's say it's a rat, it's attacking you. You roll the whatever particular die that targets your feet or your the lower part of your body. You roll the attack, you see where it hits, and you take that much damage. If you have armor there, it gets to soak up some damage, but otherwise it's just boom, take the damage. And I think that feels thematically appropriate, that they're attacking you sort of in the lower part of your body. They're small creatures. And then it's done. Their turn is over, gets back to the player. So I think that has worked really well in Arydia combat, which is quite different from the way players attack monsters. the way players attack monsters, D20 roll, see how much damage you do, decide where you put it. The monsters have a grid, so it's quite asymmetric. And I think we're going to talk about sort of the differences between player versus player combat and player versus AI combat. And I think that's one of the most important things, that you have more freedom to be more asymmetric when you're fighting against AI or the game than you are when you're fighting against other players. And that's an
Yeah.
example of that.
Yeah, you brought up so many interesting points there. One of them being the amount of time that you spend running the AI in the game versus the amount of time you spend making decisions for your character or your team. And you talked a little bit about how you had another idea that might have made it more complex and longer. Do you have any stories from that design process, how you decided that this was the right length, this was the right amount of time to spend on the AI?
Yeah. So the version, I was really focused at the time. I've seen the light, but at the time I was really focused on having a parallel system that monsters and players would attack each other in the same way. And so it tied into our goal that the loot that you get and the sort of the player mat that you have with your items on it, that's really the focus of the player's attention. We don't want necessarily players looking at cards or things like that. Cards are okay, but we really wanted, like, you're getting these cool loot tiles, you're arranging them on your board. We wanted people focused on that. And so to do that, we were, at least at the time, I was thinking the hit points were your body parts, and if you had armor, it would effectively increase your hit points, and monsters would attack with attack patterns similar to the way players attacked monsters. And that was cool. There were definitely cool things about it. For one, it made healing really interesting when you're choosing like which body part you're healing based on what sort of attack patterns the monsters have. It made a sort of a very interesting healing puzzle. And then the other thing that was, I think its real downfall was the player had to sort of decide. We iterated a lot of different ways of how the monster was going to place that damage, but in the end, the best I think we could come up with was that the player had to sort of pick the worst thing for them, and that's where the damage was going to be inflicted. And it wasn't particularly thematic because you didn't have sort of this randomness of sometimes you get a good hit, sometimes you get a bad hit. And also it was just time consuming, challenging puzzle that the player had to perform on themselves to do a bad thing. And so when Cody had this idea for the dice rolling for the hit location, it was clearly better because it was a bad thing that was happening to you. It was quick to resolve, and it didn't involve any sort of decision making on the part of the player. We left that for the player's actions and not for the monster's actions.
One little thing that I don't want to overlook here that Cody says, like Cody came up with this, is that there are these custom dice that you use that show you where the hits go, and they aren't. I don't know if there are other numbers on those dice at all, or is it just like identifying the part of your body?
Yeah, it's just a graphic. Yeah, and we had a D12 at one point that we were rolling, and it sort of favored the torso area, and then that got Cody developed that into a multiple different D6s, weighted D6s, so that we could really favor certain areas of the body. But it's just an icon, and it's good enough. You just match it up with your player mat, and it's very quick to see where the hit happens.
I think that is really clever because, as you said, it doesn't take long to roll a die. There are games. Gloomhaven is one that we'll probably talk about a little bit. Gloomhaven has a very interesting combat system that involves drawing cards for the opponents that you're playing against, which is a great system. Cards have there are benefits to using cards instead of dice, but you never need to reshuffle dice. It eliminates really any sort of maintenance to have those dice over there. So. And I love custom dice. So I think it's really clever that you guys ended up going with that. One other thing that you touched upon here is attack patterns, especially in terms of the enemy AI here. With your involvement in digital games, I haven't played it, but have you played Dark Souls, the video game?
I've seen videos. I have not gotten deep into Dark Souls. Played a little bit. It's very hard.
Yes. And that's pretty much where my understanding of the game is as well. But I think what I've heard is that one of the things that players really enjoy about Dark Souls is learning the attack patterns of these very difficult enemies that you're fighting. And this is something that I think about a lot when I think about particularly cooperative combat systems. How important is it to have unique enemies where you are learning about them as you are fighting them, to have that sense of progression where you're figuring out how to better approach different types of monsters or enemies in the game. How does Arydia do that? Do you have any examples of games, tabletop games, that you think do that well, where you're actively like learning about how this enemy fights with their attack patterns?
Right. Yeah. I think that when you're in a sort of player versus AI situation, you can make those enemies really powerful or really asymmetric, or break the normal rules of the game. And one of the games that I wanted to call attention to, which I think does this very well, is a cooperative game. It's Lord of the Rings,
Oh.
LCG.
Mhm.
And in this, I'll just show, this is from a particular quest. This is, we're not going to be able to get this card on screen, but it's totally asymmetric. Like, these are monsters in the game, enemies in the game that you have to battle, and you probably can't see it from the card text, but it says indestructible, immune to player card effects. So this guy is just like, you can't even defeat it until some other thing that you manage to trigger in the game to let it happen. And they can do
Right.
that all the time with this game. And I think it really does a good job of showing sort of what you were talking about, where you want to learn about the enemy, figure it out together. And even in the case of a game like Lord of the Rings LCG or other cooperative games, you might lose the first
Mhm.
time you play. It wouldn't be unreasonable. And then you might either craft your strategy, or potentially craft your deck. You know, in Lord of the Rings, you bring a deck to the game. For something like Arydia, you have sort of 5 skills that you get to equip before you go into battle or adventuring out. And so if you know you're going to face a certain sort of enemy, and maybe you lost an earlier battle and you're trying again, you can equip certain skills that might make you have a higher chance of success. So I think that's a useful, very hard enemies, I think, in a cooperative game is good.
It's good. Yeah. One example that came to mind for me when I was thinking about this is, have you played Shards of Infinity, particularly the
No,
cooperative expansion? No?
no, I haven't.
This is a great deck building game, and Megan and I have really enjoyed the cooperative expansion. This box is specifically the cooperative expansion. There are very difficult enemies, and when you set up the enemies, you combine 3 different decks of cards. It's like these are big bosses that you're fighting, not for every enemy, for every creature you encounter. You're not setting up a deck, but for the big box, you're shuffling together 3 decks of cards, and we found that as we played through those decks, because on the enemy turn you're revealing one of these cards, we felt like we were learning more and more about the hordes that this enemy, this boss controlled. So I thought that was a really interesting system, where there was a little bit of setup involved, because you had to take these 3 decks, you had to shuffle them together, and then at the end you had to separate them. But once we set that up, we were good for the entire game, and we had that sense of kind of knowledge progression throughout combat as we were learning more about this boss. I thought that was interesting. Okay, yeah, there's one other element of Arydia specifically that I want to talk about that branches off into another topic: the tactical nature of combat. How important do you think? So, like this example I just gave, there's no tactical nature of this combat, at least spatially tactical, in Shards of Infinity. You have a monster card that shows up and you deal damage to it in the way that works for you at that time, but you're not actually moving characters around a board. How did you all decide? I believe you had that in Arydia. There's a
Oh
movement
yeah.
system. How did you decide that was important for combat? And do you think it is generally important to have that in combat, or are there times where it's important to have that spatial nature and times where it's not needed to have that spatial nature in combat?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I feel like it depends on the theme of the game and what you're going for.
Mhm.
You know, Arydia had a very clear design goal of being this fantasy, RPG adventure, and so I think it made a lot of sense to have that. I think in Arydia, we actually kind of have 2 levels of that. We have one level, which is the position of the players and the enemies on the square grid battle map. So where you're moving in relation to them. And a lot of the skills that you have depend on your positioning to get the most effective use, either out of an area effect skill or like a snipe shot this certain distance away.
Right.
You need to position on the battle map.
Mhm.
But then beyond that, there's a second level in Arydia where you have monsters that have hit grids that are particular layouts of hit points. And so depending on your attack patterns, you're also sort of doing this Tetris game of sort of moving Tetris game, because the attacks are sort of directional. Many of them are directional, to sort of efficiently defeat the monster. So you might deal 3 damage, but if you're dealing 3 damage very efficiently, it might defeat the monster, and otherwise it might not. And so there are 2 levels of that. I feel like that was an innovative element of combat in Arydia, and I haven't seen sort of that 2-tiered tactical things, but I think many games have sort of this spatial element to it. And I think that maybe one of the reasons why is that to the amount that we're having combat being a simulation of sort of what real world battles are, sort of the position on the battlefield or the terrain or things like that often factors into real combat. And so when a game tries to model real combat, it makes sense to me that we might often get that. And then if we do, it might feel resonant. So like one example that we haven't talked about, but to me is like sort of a classic battle game, is chess, where like it's 2 players, it's player versus player. You're maneuvering these pieces on the board. That's like very tactical. But there's a greater strategy around sort of the overall positioning. And then sort of the result of an attack is just attacker always wins. Like there's no randomness, and attacker always wins. And I think that's and it's everybody has 1 hit point. It's like 1 hit point, attacker always wins, 100% chance of success of hit. So, but obviously there have been chess variants where you do it differently, but that's sort of a core mechanic in chess. That was long-winded. I hope that was useful.
It was useful, and I love the example of chess. I think did you bring your chessboard back behind you?
Oh yeah, yep. Here's the chessboard.
For those who need the chess visual. I think that's a good example. The idea that attacker always wins. Like sometimes you can distill combat down to something so simple and still have it be meaningful. And one example I wanted to throw out there, because it kind of uses a hybrid system, is Sleeping Gods. Have you played Sleeping Gods?
I did a little bit of work on the one of the expansion modes in Tides of Ruin.
I didn't know that. That's awesome. I haven't played the Tides of Ruin expansion yet, but I played a full campaign of the core game. And in Sleeping Gods, you don't have a character on a grid. You don't have that, but you do have a grid of monster cards that come out on the board whenever you enter combat with 1 or more monsters. And I don't, it's somewhere deep in this box, I can't pull it out here, but the monster cards line up so that they end up sharing a grid. And as you deal damage, you can carry over the damage from one monster using this grid over to another monster. So I thought it had a really neat, you mentioned that Tetris puzzle. It has a Tetris-like puzzle to it as you're kind of slashing across one monster, hoping to carry over and take out certain parts of the next monster as well. So I thought that was kind of a neat hybrid system where it uses a spatial element, but not necessarily using that tactical grid that other systems use.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think one of the things that Sleeping Gods does well, and that I think Arydia also does well, is that when you're playing that Tetris puzzle, not all squares are equivalent. You know, when you're playing normal Tetris, it doesn't really matter if you fill in, one or the other square. Like they're all worth the same number of points when you clear a line. But in these combat puzzle games, you might really care about covering up that square, because that square, either like in Arydia, there are critical points and weak points that sort of trigger additional effects that you might really care about or might really want to avoid. And in Sleeping Gods, there are all sorts of status effects and bonus damage things and synergistic things that, depending on where you place that damage, it really matters. And I think that asymmetry of those squares leads to a much more interesting Tetris combat puzzle. And I think that's also going back to the tactical movement. I think that that's part of the tactical movement, the asymmetry that not all squares on the board on the map are equivalent, to trigger this particular skill. I need to be in a certain spot. Terrain is another element of asymmetry on a battle map. So I think, we haven't really talked that much about asymmetry in combat, but I think that's a really natural fit for that. A lot of asymmetry, I think, can add a nice amount of spice. And these are just some examples of asymmetry in combat.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea that you can have asymmetry come out, especially when it's playing against the AI, and building that asymmetry into whatever tactical puzzle you're presenting to players. Um, and this made me think of one other thing that I think does tie to Arydia as well, which is uh, combat. You can play Arydia solo, right? You play just one player.
True solo. Yeah, just one. Yep.
But often you're probably going to be including other players, and
Yep.
I think combat is often enhanced when you really feel like you're working as a team. And so I'm curious with Arydia or any other examples that you have. Uh, what do you? How does the involvement of other players work? How does it feel like you're working together as a team, and that it's a shared puzzle instead of a solo puzzle when you enter combat?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there are lots and lots of ways we want to do that in Arydia, and I think a lot of games do this. I guess I'll talk about Arydia, but there I don't want to say it's unique to Arydia. So one of the ways is healing. I think that particularly if we have combat, there's often some sort of way of healing or repairing damage or things like that. And I think that's a real opportunity for meaningful collaboration and cooperation between players if you have healing, because that just feels great when like you help the other person and you get helped by the other person. It's just like that's a really great moment. So I think healing is really powerful, and I think for that you need to be willing to like knock down players or hurt players, and I think um, that's sort of getting that balance right is important, because if the players don't feel threatened, then and the combat doesn't feel dangerous, then the healing becomes less meaningful also. So I think that that's an area where getting that balance right really matters for multiple different reasons. Another way is, and Gloomhaven does this, a lot of games do this, having a shared resource. So in Arydia, there's a shared resource called combo, where I, on my turn, can build up combo. I can do a skill that might generate combo. And then on your turn, you can spend that combo. So it's a shared resource, and we're spending it together, we're gaining it together, and there are all sorts of asymmetries. I could have a particular build where I'm just generating a bunch of combo. I have a bunch of skills that generate a bunch of combo, and you have a bunch of skills that spend combo. And because we've coordinated that sort of our character builds, that's going to make us as a team much more effective in combat. And alone, we wouldn't either succeed, because I would have an excess of combo, you wouldn't have enough to spend. And so a shared resource, I think, is another good example of that. So those are two examples.
I love that. I had to take a note about the shared resource because I hadn't thought about how much that adds to collaboration and combat. I really like that. There's something that I want to use here to segue into combat against other players. But before we do that, do you have anything else? Well, we can come back to it, of course, but is there anything else about Arydia or combat against the AI that you wanted to throw in here before we move on a little bit?
I think that we're good. I mean, there are tons of things I could. I think that there are tons of things I can mention. I think we can come back to it.
Okay,
if
yeah,
it's appropriate. There's more to learn about Arydia combat, but I want to be able to talk about other games too. So go ahead.
Yeah, we can always definitely come back to it. But the segue that I wanted to mention here as we go to talk about combat against other players is the idea that in a lot of games where you're fighting other players, often you are just fighting one other player and the other players are sitting around waiting for that combat to happen. And if the combat is fast, that can be fine. If the combat is long, it can sometimes be entertaining, sometimes not. And I want to throw out two examples right away of recent games that I played that I thought did a great job of involving other players in combat, or involving all players really in combat, which were Dune Imperium, which I have under another game here. Dune Imperium often involves all players in combat. And even more recent for me, Dwellings of Eldervale has an interesting thing where any player can join the combat, which I thought was a really nice twist to actively include other players. And so just as a segue here, are there any games that you like where you're fighting player v player that can potentially involve more than one player in the combat?
Yeah, I think you might have mentioned this in your combat mechanics video, but it's a game that I played a lot as a kid, which is Cosmic Encounter.
Yeah.
And I think, that you can just invite allies in either side. There's often diplomacy about who you're going to invite and things like that. And I think in particular in Cosmic Encounter, one of one of the things that I like about it, and we can talk more about sort of targeting and player versus player combat. Cosmic Encounter, you don't necessarily get to pick which player you're going to attack. There's a
Right.
deck that's sort of your destiny deck. I don't remember what it's called. And
Yeah.
it sort of specifies who you have to attack. And it's just like, well, I'm sorry. And I think one of the risks in combat games, particularly games where it's not all about combat, but it's just one of the options, is that players there can sometimes, depending on the play group, have like sort of feel bad moments where somebody feels like they're getting picked on.
Yeah.
And when the game sort of solves that for you, in an example like Cosmic Encounter, that is, I think, a clever solution if you can use it, if it makes sense. And I think that also addresses another issue in a lot of these games where you get to pick who you're attacking, which is that it can sort of be attack the leader, and whoever's leading at the moment, that's who gets attacked, and then somebody else starts leading, you attack them. So sort of constraining who the players can attack, I think, is an interesting design challenge that you have to consider. It has issues related to sort of take that moments, feeling bad moments, and king making. So all that targeting stuff ties together.
It's been a while since I played it, but I recall the game Adrenaline doing a pretty good job at that. Have you played Adrenaline? It's been a couple of years for me. As I can recall, it gave you an active incentive to attack a variety of players, and with diminishing returns for each player that you had already attacked. So as far as I can recall, there were rewards at a certain point in the game after you had filled up a certain meter if you had attacked a variety of players instead of just one. So that was one interesting way of doing it, of just encouraging variety in who you're targeting. And one other thing that you can do, one of my examples here is Kemet. Kemet has one of my favorite combat systems for a variety of reasons, including kind of the input that you put into combat. But I really love in Kemet how you can in Kemet you can target the leader. There are certain players that you might end up targeting, but when you lose combat in Kemet, it isn't that bad. It gives you a moment to recover and reasons to recover. I think Dwellings does a good job of this as well. There are actually things that you can get as you're recovering from combat. Basically, losing isn't that bad and can often be like a little good. It can be a good reset for you. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. The idea of losing combat being bad enough so that you don't want to lose, but not so bad that you feel devastated if you do lose combat.
Yeah, I don't have it nearby, but I recently played Tiny Epic Pirates.
Mm-hmm.
And in Tiny Epic Pirates, if you get attacked and lose, then you get something. It's a D6 system where you want to roll certain numbers. You get something called a surefire token, which lets you set one of your D6s in a future combat to whatever number you want, making sure that you're just less likely to lose sort of multiple times in a row.
Right.
And I thought that was a clever sort of little bit of catch-up mechanic. Another game that Cody Miller designed, which I have worked on quite a bit in various expansions, is a game called Zaya Legends of a Drift System. And in that game, when you're flying a spaceship around and you have a certain amount of damage your ship can take. And when your ship explodes, you just get to respawn somewhere. You might start with a little bit of damage on you, and you might lose some cargo, but it's not that bad. And often in that game, in Zaya at least, it's often worse to take 10 out of 11 damage as opposed to just 11 out of 11 damage. Often better to blow up. So that's another game that I think does a good job of letting players sort of recover from being defeated.
Recover is a good word there. Yeah, giving you a moment to recover and then reposition yourself for the future. Yeah. Yeah, I know you have some games behind you there. Were there any player versus player combat games that you think are really interesting, and what do you think they do interesting in an interesting way?
Yeah. So I think, at the beginning of the video, you sort of articulated this difference between player versus AI or the game and sort of player versus player. Yeah. And as I was thinking about that in advance of this video, I realized that for me, at least, it more feels like three categories, where there's player versus AI. And then I think there's player versus player in a 2-player game. and player versus player in a multiplayer game.
Yeah.
Because when I'm playing, I play quite a lot of 2-player sort of player versus player games that chess or Keyforge or Magic or like many 2-player games where you're sort of battling against the other person. It doesn't feel bad when that happens because that's just the premise of the game. Obviously, that's going to happen.
Right.
There's no feel bad moment. You might feel bad for losing or something, but you don't feel bad that they're attacking you. That's just, of course, you're attacking me.
Right.
But in a 3 or more player game, when somebody attacks you, there's this moment of sort of, oh, well, why go attack them? Don't attack me.
Yeah.
That I think designers have to be careful of. And if you have the right play group or people are all on the same page, it's fine. But I think that's a real difference in sort of design and the things that I'm thinking about as a designer and the systems that I want to have in place to support the players having a good experience in a multiplayer game, player versus player, or in a 2-player game. So one game that I love it as a game, and it's a 2-player player versus player combat game, is War of the Ring.
Yeah.
And it's a giant giant sort of players, dudes on a map, very asymmetric in terms of the forces that you have, the number of actions per turn you get to take, the victory conditions. It's just a lot of asymmetry. And then there's a whole separate win condition because it's thematic about destroying the ring, because it's a Lord of the Rings themed game. And so I really like that. Combat is like important, very important, but it's just one piece of the game because there's this whole sort of ring thing too. So I guess the games that I'm really drawn to have combat as part of the game, but maybe not the whole game. And I guess in War of the Ring, in terms of the asymmetry, just to describe it, you have combat cards that you play. You have a sort of a size of force that you can bring, which is how many d6s you get to roll up to a maximum of 5. And then each player has combat cards that they can play, and they sort of put down secretly and then reveal them. And so there's this randomness of the dice rolling, but because there's enough dice rolling, often the randomness sort of can balance out with that. And there are these combat cards that the players control that really get to mitigate the randomness that I feel like many games have randomness in combat,
Yeah.
but giving the players tools to mitigate that randomness, I think that's an important design element in combat that has a lot of randomness.
Yeah, I talked about that a little bit in my skill test video, where I kind of broke it down into 4 stages, giving players an input choice, then having a random element, and then having some sort of output choice, and then ideally also then having varying degrees of success or failure. And I don't think every skill test needs to follow that. Not every combat needs to follow that. But I think having those moments where you have control and agency, and then those moments where you don't have as much control, but then you can go back and mitigate that a little bit. That balance, I think, is key to figure out when you're puzzling through the combat mechanisms for a game.
Yeah.
You also talked about something that I really like, another differentiating factor here between combat against the AI and versus player, is that when you're fighting against the AI, there are many times that you can feel clever, but you rarely get to feel sneaky because you're not fighting against an actual intelligent opponent. But when you're fighting against a player, you do get to feel sneaky. You talked about War of the Ring, putting those face down cards. In Kemet, which I have behind me here, you can actually hide little cards behind the bigger combat cards that you're playing. And I kind of use that same system in Scythe, where you get to hide little combat cards behind your combat dial. You get to have that little feeling of sneakiness. Another game, a tinier game, much smaller than the War of the Ring, that I really like is Air, Land, and Sea, which is a tug of war style game. You're fighting over 3 different theaters of combat. And some of the cards that you're playing are face down. And so the opponents, and your opponent also doesn't know what you have in hand. And so you have this sneaky feel where every time you play a card, you're doing something that your opponent doesn't know, or you know something that they don't know. And I love that element of sneakiness in player versus player combat. Do you have any? War of the Ring I think is probably a pretty good example. Can you think of anything else where you get to that element of feeling sneaky or mischievous when you play against another player in combat?
Right. Yeah, anything that involves sort of hidden information and bluffing and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of that in Magic a little bit.
Mhm.
Magic the Gathering, where you might attack and on the board it looks like you're going to lose, but you have a card in your hand that's going to trick them, or maybe you're bluffing and then they block and it
Yeah.
turns out, oh, you have it, or they don't block and you're like, I didn't have it, I just bluffed you. And then, so I think
Yeah.
that's a good example of sort of getting to trick the other player.
Right. And that's one that I like that you differentiated two-player combat games versus multiplayer combat games. But that's one thing that I think applies to both of those styles of games, giving players the opportunity to feel a little sneaky. I like I said, I really like that you differentiated those two, because I, I I think it's probably easier to design a two-player combat game, even though these games I'm sure took plenty of effort to design. But having all those other dynamics of a multiplayer combat game is so difficult. Uh, have you worked on any games like that? I think Zaya has is a multiplayer game with combat. How does that involve other players, or how does that how does the combat work in Zaya? It's been a long time
Yeah.
since I played it.
Yeah. So Cody designed the base game, and I was just a
Mm.
background Kickstarter. And that combat system is um, one versus one. There's no way in the game right now where you can sort of team up and defeat somebody or sort of come to their aid while the combat is going on. There are plenty of ways to sort of interact with players after a given moment of combat, but I think one of the things that we haven't talked about yet in sort of player versus player combat is um, if there's sort of a general battle going on for a certain region, or if you're sort of actively choosing, I'm going to attack you. I could do something else, but I'm coming to attack you because that's part of my strategy in the game, or I want to, you're winning, and so I'm going to sort of cost you resources by fighting you. Um, and I think in the situation, I haven't played Dune Imperium yet, but my sense is that in Dune Imperium, you're sort of, there's a battle, but it's not like could you describe it? Are you attacking somebody else? Or is it sort of you're fighting over resources and whoever wins the battle gets a reward, but it's not like you're attacking somebody directly. Is that true?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I think in Zaya, and many combat games, in Civilization that I mentioned, you're attacking a certain player, and I think in those situations, one important element is for the player who's on the defense
Mhm.
to feel like they have some agency in their own defense. Um, and so, for instance, in Zaya, the attacker sort of declares the weapons that they're using, and they're saying, I'm gonna blast you with these things, and then the defender gets to decide sort of what shields they're going to use or what defensive abilities they're going to use, and they have a moment um, as another player to sort of be the defender, and they sort of inhabit that role. And I think that's an important element of player versus player combat, particularly in a multiplayer game, where you want that person to have maybe saved up some resource or something they could spend or they could not spend. Um, so I think that's a nice element in multiplayer player versus player combat.
And one of the difficulties that I ran into while designing Scythe, specifically relation to that, giving like the defender some agency, is uh, giving. So it's a combination of a couple of different things. One, it's giving players a reason or a motivation to attack at all if you've included combat in your game. Um, Also giving defenders a reason to defend if it costs them anything to actually defend, to actually put up a little bit of a fight at least. But also not having defenders have so much agency, so much power that you dissuade attackers from attacking at all. So that was something that I fought back and forth during the side design to try to get that balance exactly right. And a few of the little things I did, one of the main thing I did is that if you are attacking a player, a mech that has workers, a mech or character that has workers on the same territory, you win combat, you will lose popularity for doing so. So just as a built-in deterministic defense mechanism, you can walk around with workers or make sure that workers are on the hexes that you want to protect to kind of discourage players from attacking you there. But you're not actually gaining an advantage in combat. Those workers, unless you have a special ability, those workers aren't making you better at defending. They are just discouraging players from attacking you because they'll lose popularity. But that puzzle, that back and forth of making players want to attack, but still giving defenders agency, I think is a really tough puzzle to figure out in combat.
Yeah, and particularly in games like Xayah or Scythe, where combat is one path, one thing you can do, but among many, where
Right.
you want it to be an element of the game, but you don't want it to dominate the whole game.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. That's a very tricky balance.
That actually is you didn't know this, but that was a segue into one of the final topics that I wanted to ask you about today, which is uh, oftentimes in games, combat can become a big part of the game. And there are games built around combat. Gloomhaven is pretty much built around combat. It's a tactical combat game. Kemet is a multiplayer combat game. Everything is built around that combat, although there is a good tech tree system as well. But even that's built around combat. Everything is pushing you towards combat. But I also think that there are other things to do in games that are just as interesting as combat and can offer just as interesting puzzles, even though they might feel a little bit like combat. And I'll throw out one quick example here, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. And that is, there's a video game, a digital game called Griftlands. I haven't played a lot of Griftlands, but what intrigued me about it, it's one of these roguelike deck building games, kind of like Slay the Spire. But in Griftlands, you have the option of fighting the people that you encounter, or you can have what is essentially a conversational battle with them. So it is combat, but it is not fighting. You're not dealing damage. You're having an argument. You're having a negotiation with them. And there's a whole separate deck of cards that you use for that. And that really kind of opened it up to me. It opened me up to thinking about, like, why aren't there more systems like that in tabletop games where it's not just about fighting the monster, but there's also just as interesting a system for debating with the monster or bribing the monster or trying to somehow befriend the monster. You've mentioned several times in the video that this idea of War of the Ring is more about just combat. Xayah, same thing. Do you have any thoughts about this? Do you think sometimes games sway too heavily towards combat where they could use just as interesting systems for non-combat interactions?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought this up, because I think that one of the things that I think about as a designer is sort of how to broaden the audience of game players in general.
Yeah.
And I think that combat, in some ways, sort of traditional combat battle, games are the lowest hanging fruit of game design. And not to say that those games don't require a lot of skill to design, but just I think that when you think of sort of simulating some real world thing, that's like something that games might do well. And so I think thinking more broadly about ways that games can allow players to have conflict, but not necessarily battles, I think is really important. And I think we certainly thought about that in Arydia. That is part of the game. You definitely, there are battles, but there are ways to avoid some battles also. And I think that one game that you mentioned in your previous, very briefly, previous combat mechanics video was a game that I played quite a bit called Tainted Grail. And they have two completely separate decks of cards. One is sort of your combat deck, and the other is your diplomacy deck. And there are many interactions that if you successfully have diplomacy, which use like somewhat similar, but also not completely the same mechanics. If you succeed at various diplomacy things, you can just avoid combat. You can avoid bad things. And sometimes like combat's coming for you, but if you're a really good talker, you can get out of it. And because of their leveling system and progression system in that game, you can build a really strong diplomacy deck and improve your diplomacy related skills, sort of at the expense of your combat skills. And it's a viable way of playing that game. And so I think that's a great example of really offering player choice, both during progression and during gameplay. So I would encourage people to check that out if they haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, I don't know if it was designed at the same time as Griftlands, but it's fairly similar systems. And I like what you said there is that you don't have to completely learn a new system, because that could be a little overbearing at some point if you have all of these interesting systems, but you have to learn a completely different system each time. But if there's a little bit of overlap, or maybe even a lot of overlap between them, um, but still maybe different outcomes, different approaches, I think that can help encourage players to actually try those different methods rather than just get to know one really well. Yeah. I've loved this conversation, Ira. We're around an hour mark here, and I'm glad we left an hour for this, because you had so many interesting thoughts about Arydia and other games. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything that you wanted to mention before we take off?
I think we covered a lot of good things. So I really
Good.
appreciate you inviting me. And it's, you know, I've watched a lot of your content, read a lot of your blog, and I really appreciate what you do for the community of game designers. It's great to get to participate in this conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Awesome. All right. Well, I will stop the recording here. Let's see.